A real estate developer with zero diplomatic experience walks into the Kremlin. He strolls through Zaryadye Park with Vladimir Putin's personal money man, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. They chat like old friends. Then he sits down with Putin himself for 3 to 4 hours. He does this 5 times in a single year. When he gets back to Washington, he tells CNBC that Russia denied sharing intelligence with Iran. "We can take them at their word," he says. "Let's hope they're not sharing." His name is Steve Witkoff. He is America's special envoy. And a leaked transcript shows him coaching the Kremlin's top foreign policy aide on how to pitch a peace deal to Donald Trump. He's not the only one. The woman in charge of America's 18 intelligence agencies, the person who decides what the president sees and what he doesn't, once asked burned Syrian children how they knew it wasn't ISIS that bombed them. She has parroted Kremlin talking points on Ukraine, on biological weapons, on NATO expansion. A whistleblower says she blocked a highly classified NSA report about a foreign intelligence call involving someone close to Trump and hand-delivered it to the White House Chief of Staff instead. Her name is Tulsi Gabbard. She is the Director of National Intelligence. And then there's the Defense Secretary who, in one of his first acts, ordered U.S. Cyber Command to stand down from all operations against Russia. Every offensive digital capability, every piece of planning, halted. While Russia was conducting the most aggressive sabotage campaign against the West in decades. His name is Pete Hegseth. 3 officials, 3 Russian connections, 0 consequences, and a question that hangs over Washington like smoke. Is anyone actually watching the door? To understand how Washington arrived at this point, you have to trace each thread separately, because nobody planned this. Nobody sat in a dark room and drew up an org chart. The result is messier than that, and in some ways, far more dangerous. Start with Witkoff. Before he became Trump's most trusted diplomatic channel, he was a Manhattan real estate developer. His company, the Witkoff Group, built skyscrapers. His friendship with Trump dates back to the 1980s, when they moved through the same circles of concrete, capital, and ambition. Nothing in his biography suggests expertise in Eastern European geopolitics. Nothing suggests he understands the dynamics between Moscow and Kyiv, or the levers of nuclear deterrence, or the history of NATO's eastward expansion. Alexandra Filipenko, a U.S.-Russia relations expert, put it plainly. Steve Witkoff is simply someone Trump trusts. Their relationship dates back to the 1980s Manhattan real estate scene. Trump values that kind of loyalty. And in this administration, loyalty is the only qualification that matters. By late 2025, Witkoff had met Putin at least 5 times, sessions lasting 3 to 4 hours each. He used Kremlin-provided translators. He echoed Russian talking points in media interviews. He legitimized referendums in occupied Ukrainian territory on Tucker Carlson's show, saying the regions were Russian-speaking and want to be under Russian rule. And then the transcript leaked. A Bloomberg report in November 2025 published the contents of a phone call between Witkoff and Yuri Ushakov, Putin's senior foreign policy advisor. On the recording, Witkoff tells Ushakov, "I know what it's going to take to get a peace deal done. Donetsk and maybe a land swap somewhere." He advises the Kremlin aide on timing. Call Trump before Zelensky visits the White House. He reassures him that Trump will give Russia space and discretion. Republican Congressman Don Bacon called for his immediate dismissal. Would a Russian paid agent do less than he wrote? Democratic Representative Ted Lieu went further. Actual traitor. Trump's response? That's what a dealmaker does. Then there's the financial web. Byline Times reported in December 2025 that Witkoff's real estate empire has been financed in part by a former advisor to Dmitriev, the same man he was strolling through Moscow with. His developments drew on investment vehicles linked to post-Soviet networks intertwined with Russia's political elite. The Witkoff Group secured a $256 million refinancing from Blackstone, whose chair, Steven Schwartzman, sat on the advisory board of Putin's sovereign wealth fund from 2011 to 2014. These are not random connections. They form an ecosystem, one where diplomatic access, personal loyalty, and financial entanglement converge in ways that would have triggered investigations in any previous administration. And it gets worse. As recently as March 11th, 2026, a Russian team met Witkoff's team in Florida. The two sides discussed a variety of topics, according to Witkoff, and agreed to stay in touch. At a moment when Russia was providing targeting intelligence to Iran against American forces, the U.S. Special Envoy was holding friendly meetings with Russian officials in Palm Beach. Now consider Gabbard. Her story is different. It's ideological, not transactional. She entered Congress as an anti-war Democrat, a veteran of Iraq, someone who believed the United States had no business toppling foreign governments. Fair enough. Plenty of reasonable people hold that view. But her version of anti-interventionism came with a peculiar feature. It always somehow aligned with Moscow's position. When Russia entered the Syrian war in 2015, bombing civilians to prop up Bashar al-Assad, Gabbard praised the move on Twitter. Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11 and must be defeated. Obama won't bomb them in Syria. Putin did. She traveled to Damascus in 2017 to meet Assad, the first sitting U.S. lawmaker to do so since the war began. When confronted with evidence of chemical weapons attacks, she suggested rebels staged false flag operations. She refused to call Assad a war criminal. When Russia invaded Ukraine, she blamed NATO. This war could have easily been avoided if Biden admin/NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns. She repeated Russian claims about U.S.-funded biological weapons labs in Ukraine, claims debunked by every credible intelligence assessment. She called Ukraine not a democracy. She co-sponsored legislation to drop charges against Edward Snowden. Charles Lister, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, spent years debunking her conspiracy theories about Syria. Her consistent denial of the Syrian regime's crimes is so wildly fringe that her potential appointment as DNI is genuinely alarming, he said. Her descriptions of the crisis in Syria read like they were composed in Assad's personal office, or in Tehran or Moscow, not Washington. By early 2025, she was Director of National Intelligence, overseeing the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and 15 other agencies, the same agencies she had spent years publicly undermining. And then, the whistleblower emerged. In spring 2025, the NSA flagged an unusual phone call between two members of foreign intelligence discussing a person close to Trump. The information was brought to Gabbard. Rather than allowing normal dissemination, she took a paper copy directly to Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff. The next day, she told the NSA not to publish the report. For 8 months, the intelligence was locked away. The whistleblower filed a formal complaint. The acting inspector general dismissed it after a 14-day review, saying they could not determine if the allegations appear credible. Gabbard assigned one of her own advisors to work in the inspector general's office, 2 weeks after the complaint was filed. 2 attorneys and 2 former intelligence professionals reviewing the case told The Guardian they identified a series of procedural anomalies that raise questions about Gabbard's handling of national intelligence. The ODNI claimed the delay was caused by the complaint's top-secret classification, the fall government shutdown, and the Inspector General's failure to notify Gabbard of her reporting requirements. But the timeline tells its own story. Whistleblower contacts Inspector General. Gabbard installs her own advisor in the watchdog's office. Complaint gets dismissed. That is the person deciding what intelligence reaches the President of the United States. The names are important. But what matters more is the outcome. Because while Washington debates whether these individuals are compromised, naive, or simply ideologically aligned with Moscow, Russia has been collecting concrete wins at an extraordinary pace. Start with the cyber shutdown. In March 2025, Defense Secretary Hegseth ordered U.S. Cyber Command to stand down from all planning against Russia. Offensive operations, information warfare, everything. The order went from Hegseth to General Timothy Haw, who leads both Cyber Command and the NSA, and then down to the outgoing Director of Operations. The implications were staggering. A quarter of the Cyber National Mission Force's offensive units were focused on Russia. They were monitoring the GRU, Russian military intelligence, as it conducted what CSIS documented as the most aggressive sabotage campaign against the West in modern history. Russian attacks against European and US targets nearly tripled between 2023 and 2024. They included bombings of transportation networks, attacks on undersea fiber optic cables, electronic warfare, and arson at defense companies. And the US response? Stand down. Cyber Command compiled a risk assessment for Hegseth, a document that acknowledged the order, listed what missions were halted, and detailed what threats still emanated from Russia. The document essentially told the defense secretary, "Here is what you are now allowing to happen unchecked." The stand down came as part of what the administration called a reset in ties between Washington and Moscow. That reset took many forms. In August 2025, Trump hosted Putin at a summit in Anchorage, Alaska, ending the Russian president's decade-long pariah status with NATO states. An open Interpol warrant for Putin's arrest, issued by the International Criminal Court for trafficking Ukrainian children, was ignored by US authorities. Russian state television pushed the narrative that Trump and Putin were close friends. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov wore a t-shirt with the Cyrillic initials for the USSR. Sanctions threats came and went without consequence. Trump declared in July 2025 that Russia had 50 days to agree to a peace deal or face secondary sanctions. The deadline passed. Then another. Russia remains one of the very few countries the administration has not imposed substantial tariff hikes on. Then came the oil gift. On March 13, 2026, 4 days ago, the Trump administration temporarily lifted sanctions on Russian oil stranded at sea, allowing 124 million barrels to flow to global buyers. The justification: containing energy prices spiked by the Iran war and the Strait of Hormuz blockade. Putin's team celebrated. Kirill Dmitriev, the same man who walks through Moscow parks with Witkoff, posted a waving Russian flag on X with the caption, "Buy Russian oil and gas to maintain a balanced energy supply." The Kremlin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said Russia recognized Washington's attempt to stabilize energy markets and that our interests coincide. European leaders were less enthusiastic. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called the decision wrong. French President Emmanuel Macron said the oil price surge in no way justified lifting sanctions. The European Council President wrote that weakening sanctions increases Russian resources to wage the war of aggression against Ukraine. And here is the detail that should make anyone uneasy. While Washington was easing sanctions on Russian oil, Russia was actively providing Iran with targeting intelligence to strike American forces. The Washington Post reported on March 6th that Moscow was sharing the locations of U.S. warships and aircraft in the Middle East with Tehran. One official described it as a pretty comprehensive effort. Iran's own ability to locate American forces had been degraded since the U.S.-Israeli strikes began. Russia was filling the gap. When asked about it, Trump told the Financial Times, "I don't know one way or the other, but you could also make the case that we helped Ukraine to an extent. It's hard to say, you're targeting us, but we've been helping Ukraine." That is the President of the United States, drawing a moral equivalence between U.S. support for a country defending itself from invasion and Russian assistance in targeting American soldiers. Senator Alyssa Slotkin, a former CIA officer, wrote on X, "If Russia is helping to kill U.S. forces, we have crossed a Rubicon. We have to take decisive action. Instead, we're giving them breaks on oil, and they're making a ton of money." There's a tendency when discussing Russian influence in Washington to frame it as a political story. Left versus right, hawks versus doves, Trump-Russia conspiracy theories recycled from 2016. But this is not 2016. This is not about stolen emails or Facebook ads or Christopher Steele's dossier. This is about structural policy decisions that are reshaping the global order in real time. and they have direct consequences for anyone with money exposed to global markets. Consider the chain of causation. The Iran war has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, blocking roughly 10 million barrels of oil per day from the global market. Brent crude is above $100. The International Energy Agency has ordered the largest release of government reserves in its history, 400 million barrels. It hasn't been enough. With Iranian oil offline and the Strait mined, the world needs alternative supply. The administration's answer? Release Russian oil. That decision means Russia, currently waging the largest land war in Europe since 1945 and simultaneously feeding targeting data to Iran, gets a financial lifeline at the exact moment the West should be tightening the noose. If you hold European assets, this matters directly. European leaders are now openly at odds with Washington over sanctions policy. The transatlantic alliance, which has been the bedrock of Western economic coordination since Bretton Woods, is fracturing over whether to maintain pressure on Moscow. If you hold energy positions, you're navigating a market where the US government is making supply decisions based on geopolitical deals with the very country that is sabotaging Western infrastructure and feeding intelligence to America's enemies. If you hold defense stocks, and many in this audience do, you're watching a Pentagon that just stood down its cyber capabilities against the country running the most aggressive shadow war campaign against NATO in decades. And if you simply hold dollars, consider this. The administration that promised to restore American strength is currently being played by a country whose GDP is smaller than Italy's. Russia's economy is roughly $2 trillion, about the size of Texas. Yet it has managed to extract sanctions relief, diplomatic normalization, a summit at Anchorage, a halting of cyber operations, and a presidential comparison between Russian attacks on US soldiers and American aid to Ukraine. The question is not whether Trump is a Russian agent. It's far simpler than that. The question is whether the people around him, the envoys, the intelligence chiefs, the defense secretaries, are making decisions that consistently benefit Moscow, and whether the system of checks and balances that should catch this has been so thoroughly eroded that nobody can stop it. Europe has begun to answer for itself. In 2025, Germany, Britain, France, and the Nordic countries quietly took over the defense burden that Washington abandoned. European support for Ukraine has filled the gap left by the US withdrawal. Military drone production in Ukraine has devastated Russian oil infrastructure, cutting output by 20 to 25%. But Europe cannot replace the United States as a global security guarantor. And if Washington continues on its current trajectory, with a DNI who blocks classified intelligence, an envoy who coaches the Kremlin, and a defense secretary who orders cyber stand-downs, the implications extend far beyond Ukraine. They extend to every investor calculating risk in a world where the referee has left the field. Here is what cold analysis suggests you should be watching. The Iran war is not ending soon. Tehran has declared it will not allow 1 liter of oil to be exported from the Gulf while strikes continue. Oil above $100 is the new baseline, not the spike. Russia's leverage grows with every barrel the world needs, and every concession Washington makes to Moscow, every sanctions waiver, every cyber stand-down, every diplomatic normalization, shifts the global balance of power in ways that don't reverse when the news cycle moves on. This is not about politics. This is about capital allocation in a world where the country that was supposed to enforce the rules is now negotiating with the country that broke them, using envoys who were financed by Russian-linked money, intelligence chiefs who parrot Kremlin positions, and defense secretaries who unilaterally disarm against Moscow's cyber forces. In October 2025, at the Fiena Hotel in Miami Beach, one of the most exclusive venues in the city, Steve Witkoff sat across from Kirill Dmitriev to finalize a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine. Jared Kushner joined them. The venue was co-owned by Len Blavatnik, a Ukrainian-born billionaire whose fortune grew from post-Soviet deals with one of Putin's closest oligarchs. When the plan landed, Zelensky told his nation, Ukraine may soon face an extremely difficult choice, either the loss of dignity or the risk of losing a key partner. Nobody in that Miami hotel room was representing Ukraine's interests. Nobody was representing the European allies who would bear the consequences. Nobody was representing the American soldiers whose positions were, at that very moment, being relayed by Russian intelligence to Iranian missile batteries. A Republican congressman looked at all of this and asked a simple question: would a Russian paid agent do less? If you find yourself unable to answer that question, you're beginning to understand the problem.